Glad we cleared that up. Michael Williams, director of the Wheeler Centre for Books, Writing and Ideas, is my co-host. Our first guest, Liam Houlihan, has written a book about the goings-on in Melbourne that attracted so many headlines and caught our attention over such a long period of time. He has tied together the underworld killings, the whole, you can go back, I suppose, to Alphonse Gangitano and Carl Williams and Tony Mockbell. But what was going on at the same time in the police force? Paul Dale. And then the change at the police force that led to Simon Overland being put in charge of Piranha and then ultimately becoming Chief Commissioner. And then, oh yeah, that's right, what happened to Simon Overland? How come he's not the Chief Commissioner anymore? And what happened when Peter Ryan stopped being the police minister, because there was some sort of, I can't quite remember the detail. Well, Liam can. He's written a book about it all, and Liam Houlihan with his new book, Once Upon a Time in Melbourne, Dirty Cops, Lying Politicians, Vampire Gigolos, an unbelievable but true story. And he's our first guest on the Conversation Hour in just a moment.
On 774 ABC Melbourne.
Our first guest is a man who actually can understand and make sense of the quite literally hard to believe, unbelievable events of Melbourne's underworld and police and all the rest of it, and politicians, it must be said, over the last decade or so. Liam Houlihan is an award-winning journalist. He's written a book called Once Upon a Time in Melbourne. The subtitle, and I love this, Dirty Cops, Lying Politicians, Vampire Gigolos, an unbelievable true story. Any book that's got Vampire Gigolo on the cover has to do well, and Liam, congratulations.
Thanks for having me.
Well, there are so many bits of this that are overlooked or forgotten or fade into distant memory, and you've put it all together, so I thank you for doing that. Take us back from your point of view. Where does it all begin?
It all begins, in my story, this sort of decade of tumultuous events we had in Melbourne involving the politicians, the police, murdered vampire gigolos, fights in the police force, police corruption, the whole banana. It starts for me with the murder of the vampire gigolo Shane Chartres Abbott in Reservoir, and the police trying to untangle what was behind that and actually finding some brother officers potentially involved.
In which case, we can't avoid talking about Paul Dale right up front, and we need to be aware that Mr Dale has never been convicted of anything, maintains his innocence, and has even been foolish enough to come into this and other media studios in order to try and protest about how unfortunate the events of the world have unfolded against him, and people have all got the wrong idea about him.
Yes, well, Paul Dale's been a very, very unlucky man, if that's the case. He wasn't linked to the vampire gigolo. From the vampire gigolo murder, the story sort of bleeds into the murder of the Hodsons, and that was obviously what Paul Dale was accused of having links to. But both events put the spotlight on police involvement in murders, or alleged police involvement in murders, and that mutated in its own way because Victoria was sort of looking up and saying, well, what are we going to do about all this alleged police corruption? And the then Bracks government made a series of sort of gestures, what I describe as on the hop, which had their own consequences both in the political sphere and in the police force.
But do you see the police corruption at that time as being kind of endemic, or was it some isolated cases that were a symptom of a bigger problem?
I don't think it was like the sort of widespread police corruption that necessarily we had in other states of Australia that led to their own royal commissions, but it was a level of seriousness, if the allegations were right, where what was basically happening was state witnesses were being murdered by the police force, which is, in my view, much worse than anything that was allegedly happening interstate that precipitated the Wood Royal Commission or the Fitzgerald inquiry. So we've always had a very different, more sophisticated, more subterranean kind of type of police corruption in Melbourne and in Victoria.
People in witness protection have been murdered?
That's right.
A man was murdered whilst he was supposedly in the most secure prison, in the most secure part of the most secure prison in the whole of Victoria, but was still killed, and we still don't really know why, because the man who did it has never said boo.
Well, that's correct. Carl Williams was murdered in his cell. We can say that he was helping police. We should point out there are still suppression orders in relation to some of this, which is why Liam is saying we can say he was helping police. There's other things we can't say, Liam. There's other things we can't say, and we can't, for instance, name, going back to the vampire gigolo, we can't name the criminal in jail who started telling police, well, there are other police involved. But what his sort of hair-raising confessional did lead to was the Nixon Overland regime investigating their rival in the police union, Paul Mullett, because one of his union police buddies was allegedly involved in that vampire murder plot.
We also can't talk about how... Well, we can talk about this part of it. We can talk about how a senior barrister at the Melbourne Bar in charge of the defence of various people accused agreed to cooperate with police in order to provide information to them about people who she had actually represented.
Yes, I believe we can name her in that context.
Nicola Gobbo.
Yes.
Who went on to, in fact, then sue the police, saying that by cooperating with the police and entering into an arrangement at the police's request, she had lost herself some considerable income for which she required and sought compensation.
That's correct. So Nicola Gobbo wore a wire to record Paul Dale talking about various matters, and then everything sort of went south from there. And so
for her,
for basically everyone in this story.
But there's no winners? That's upsetting.
I'd say Paul Dale, at the end of this story, Paul Dale is the big winner. He has the lucky streak of all lucky streaks. He beats all his charges.
Everyone who's ever lined up in order to give evidence against him, they get bashed in prison or they get shot. I mean, he never gets the chance to prove his innocence that he so eagerly... He seeks that opportunity, Mr. Dale.
Well, he's released a book. He does media interviews.
He did.
He has his day.
I think he did 2, didn't he?
He did a couple that didn't go brilliantly.
No, one of them was he was sitting in the chair you're sitting in now. Actually, Liam.
I hope he hasn't rigged it. He's had his say.
Liam, he cried.
Right.
He cried.
Well, you're hard hitting, John. Like I'm sure you applied the thumb screws.
I thought it was extraordinary.
Mm. So he's the...
But you know what else he did in here? He never held my gaze.
Right.
The way
you were going to say never held your hand. But I was
the way you
say
are
John.
now. And in my little experience both in a radio studio or in a courtroom, evasive witnesses look around, and witnesses who are confident about their story are quite happy to hold your eyeballs with theirs. Mr. Dale, at no stage, during a 20-minute interview, at no stage did he barely, for more than a moment, look at me.
Mm. So the most interesting part, I think, of the Dale story is the part that isn't that well known, and the book details it. That book being Once Upon a Time in Melbourne. His dealings with the criminal little Tommy Ivanovic, who's still in Barwon and who was there when Carl Williams was murdered inside. His dealings with him early on raised the eyebrows of lawyers involved in that case, and they ultimately referred Dale to the police integrity body of the time. And it's those early... Paul Dale's got sort of excuses for everything, but those early dealings with Tommy, I find him most unpersuasive on. So the book certainly takes a view, because it's a sort of a driving narrative, and despite all the complications, it's essentially a bunch of characters, and it takes a view. And a lot of the narrative is the police case against Paul Dale, and his dealings with Tommy have never really been explained in a satisfactory way. So Paul Dale might have beat all his charges along the way, being the only real survivor in this story, who gets to go home and live in a big house, happily in Victoria. But there's some things that aren't explained.
There's a few other things that aren't explained. Why did Simon Overland stop being the Police Commissioner of Victoria?
The final trigger event was the police statistics kerfuffle, which essentially involved Simon Overland choosing to release crime statistics that purportedly showing a type of crime was down in the inner city just before the state election. When it emerged that these were unsettled statistics, they weren't completely reliable after the state election, it was the final straw. Taking a broader view, the story my book tells is that the Liberals were never comfortable. The coalition were never comfortable with Simon Overland. They thought he was essentially a Labor Party stoolie.
They thought Christine Nixon and Simon Overland were too friendly to the Labor side of politics.
Well, that's correct. And Christine Nixon says in her biography she was a card-carrying member of the Labor Party as a young woman in New South Wales. So they weren't far wrong there, but whether it actually taints the way they do their job in a political way, who's to say? Simon Overland had also done some work experience when he was with the Feds in Canberra with a federal Labor Party minister in the Keating government.
I think he worked for Duncan Kerr, the Minister for Justice at the time.
I think it was.
Yep. But he was a liaison officer. It was a job.
Yes, exactly.
It wasn't a political appointment. It was a public service appointment.
No. But the view was, rightly or wrongly, among the coalition in Victoria that Simon Overland was a Labor Party man. He was installed by the Labor Party and he was very friendly to them and he did their bidding against the coalition when they were in opposition. And there was a number of people, such as Andrew McIntosh, who had fights with him.
The former Shadow Minister. And then Peter Ryan was made Minister for Police and Emergency Services, a portfolio that he lost. And there are reasons why that happened, although I don't think Peter Ryan's ever told us quite what happened. We don't really know why Simon Overland resigned. We don't really know why Ted Baillieu resigned, and we don't really know why Peter Ryan was stripped of the police ministry.
Sure. So the criminal aspects we were talking about earlier in those cases and the fight against police corruption, they bled into the police political sphere, and then they bled into the pure political sphere. So the book details how the big lie, when Ted came to power, there was a prominent view that the coalition got along so badly with this Chief Commissioner, Simon Overland, that they would just get rid of him in one sort of fell swoop. They didn't, and they went about sort of unravelling all their previous statements and saying, no, we've never had a problem with the Chief Commissioner. We're quite happy with the Police Chief Commissioner, Simon Overland. But of course it was a lie, and it was
In fact, they were frantically undermining him from day one.
They were, and it went both ways. There were situations where Simon Overland didn't like some of the policies of the coalition, such as the PSOs that were forced on him, and in certain circles he wasn't backward about talking about that, undermining his coalition political masters at that point, at least according to sources. So it was an unhappy relationship that the police statistics was just sort of the final straw.
But in fact, what happened is Peter Ryan, the police minister at the time, hired an advisor who was an ex-policeman.
That's right.
Whose name was?
Tristan Weston.
And Tristan Weston, of all the people that Peter Ryan could have chosen to be his advisor, of all the candidates in all of Victoria who could have been a good liaison with Simon Overland, Peter Ryan chose Tristan Weston, and Tristan Weston and Simon Overland
had history
and had previously come to blows.
So the book details...
Sorry, figuratively speaking.
Yes. So the book details how sort of Tristan Weston's contempt for Simon Overland matured like a fine vinegar. He didn't like him when he was in the force, and then when he went on secondment to work for Peter Ryan, Simon Overland actively said, how about we give you someone else? How about we give you someone more senior? To which Peter Ryan said, no, thanks, Simon, we're happy with our appointment. However, Tristan Ryan was always portrayed as being off on this...
Tristan Weston,
Freudian slip, was always portrayed as being off on a frolic of his own.
Well, Peter Ryan would have us believe that it was a frolic of his own.
He was a single-man undermining machine.
Peter Ryan would have us believe that his own personal ministerial advisor on policing matters was doing things that the minister didn't know about and didn't approve of, nor endorsed, and that's a bit of a stretch. And
that's correct. And while Weston was sort of... Machiavelli in short shorts, he went about his job, very rapidly. He took to the job, arguably worked harder and more vociferously than his political masters. But it beggars belief that no one else in that office knew what he was up to, especially when he was writing memos to his colleagues. The reality is lots of people in the coalition didn't like Simon Overland, didn't think he was doing a good job, regarded him as having a series of bungles, including the parolee killers crisis, and it was blowing up at all ends. But this essentially the big lie and the cover-up is what, in my view, brought the Ted Baillieu government down.
I'm trying to keep up here, and I'm just upset because it would appear that the vampire gigolo is the least seedy character in the whole story, which is is kind of a bit disconcerting. He seems like kind of an upstanding citizen somewhere at the start of the whole thing.
Well, it's funny how the story moves sort of from the street.
We shouldn't laugh. This is supposed to, we shouldn't laugh, but we just can't help it.
So the story moves from the street to the police to the parliament, and it arguably doesn't get less grubby. In fact, people who talk to me about Once Upon a Time in Melbourne say they're not blown away by the fact that, a vampire gigolo was blown away in a street in a reservoir. They're blown away by the games played in Parliament.
What fascinates me, though, is when you build into a narrative this stuff, that happens over time, and you must see it as a crime reporter. Isolated incidents that seem kind of on their own to be, whatever they are, suddenly take on this greater meaning when wrapped into a bigger narrative. And I think about when the first series of Underbelly was completed, and Justice Betty King said it couldn't be screened in Victoria. And it's interesting to think about what a different time it is now with the internet being what it is and everything else, that the idea that you would be passing over videotapes on the border to watch these stories is such a thing of the past. But a narrative like yours is similar to Underbelly in that it puts these things, it infers meaning from all these kind of different incidents.
Well, yeah, I think it reveals meaning that's actually there. So I think the Gangland War was a big... I think Melbourne was sort of proud in a contrary way of the Gangland War because it was something else that we had that Sydney didn't have. It made us a bit bad. Until
they've got the bridge, we've got
we've got Chicago in the 30s, But they... I think what happens when you remove the sort of sexiness of the Gangland War and all those characters and all the gunshots is this bizarre political story, and that the battle against police corruption and the things that were brought in, like the OPI, which had their own consequences, and that were arguably used by the Chief Commissioner against his workplace rivals.
And we had the battle between the OPI and the Ombudsman's Office. But
yes.
There's two other elements we haven't even touched on, Liam, and they're almost worthy of a book on their own. Each of them not together. The role of the Police Association and the internal politics of the Police Association, which, as I understand it, is still being played out today.
Yes, so Paul Mullett isn't the type to cool his heels, and he really is the character in the book that bursts off the pages, because Paul Mullett was this hero cop. He looked down the barrels of criminals' guns a number of times, won 2 Valour Awards. He was no doubt a barbarian, on the side of the good guys on the street. But then when he entered the sort of the polite tea rooms of politics, he kept acting the barbarian. And I make the point that when Jeff lost power, Jeff Kennett, in the surprise election defeat in 99, I think, off the top of my head, Mullett had realised that politicians were a lot like suspects. If you threaten to rip their heads off, they'll give you anything you want. And so he had a big part in Jeff's decline, and after that became a very, very powerful figure, and the Police Association became arguably the most powerful union in the land.
And played its politics as tough as anybody did. And the other major player in all of this is the media, or dare I say some parts of the media who decided they'd rather be players rather than reporters.
Mm-hmm. What are we talking about exactly?
The various investigations into, in particular, Simon Overland show that media figures, including the newspaper empire that you work for, were part of the strategy of various politicians and, in particular, the Police Association in undermining Simon Overland. There were people in television, radio and print media in Melbourne who were part of a strategy and were either unaware that they were part of it or happy to go along with it. Either way, in my view, just as culpable.
Well, this is the interesting thing about this story is that it polarises. Everyone sort of chose a side in Melbourne.
No, they didn't.
Hang on, I'm just going to get some popcorn. Keep going.
I'm not saying... I wouldn't say that the Herald Sun chose a side any less than you chose a side, John. I think you're a bigger fan of Simon Overland than, for instance, rival radio commentators. Simon Overland had a series of bungles under his belt, including the parolee killers crisis, that had people questioning the job he was doing. There was this hotbed of sort of antipathy from his political masters, who were publicly saying we support him, but privately saying, no, we could bone him any day now.
It's on the public record.
I think you're referring to the OPI report, Crossing the Line.
It's on the public record that there were people in the media who actively worked with politicians and minders and political advisors to create the impression that Simon Overland was incompetent or dishonest, neither of which is true.
Well, he wasn't dishonest. He wasn't in the sense that he wasn't corrupt. Whether he was competent, I think there weren't lies being rolled out that were being reproduced. There was tips being rolled out that were being looked into and stood up, including the parolee killers kerfuffle, which was a disgrace in terms of the management of that. And it was ultimately what set him at odds with Sir Ken, who was someone else he couldn't get along with in his workplace. Now, what you're talking about, the OPI report, that also made the mistake of essentially pinning all the blame on Tristan Weston and giving Peter Ryan and others a leave pass, I think was a fairly faulty report, and I think was one of the last cries of the dying duck that was the OPI.
One day some of the missing pieces may indeed turn up. It will be fascinating when they do. In the meantime, I can't thank you enough. Someone had to do this, and you have, and you've done it wonderfully. Liam Houlihan's book, Once Upon a Time in Melbourne, Dirty Cops, Lying Politicians, Vampire Gigolos. It is our city and our state. It's our own recent history. You've lived through it in the daily news cycle. If you want some perspective on it, well, I can't recommend the book enough, personally. Once Upon a Time in Melbourne, Liam Houlihan, award-winning journalist, crime reporter with the Sunday Herald Sun, has done the legwork, and we've touched on about 1% of the true story. There you go. Michael Williams, my co-host. I'm Jon Faine. Our next guest, she celebrates the work and the contribution to public debate of her late partner, Paul Mees. Erica Chavini lived with and was, well, I think I can say, the partner of Paul Mees, who was the original public transport activist who helped establish the Public Transport Users Association and a civic debate in the city over decades about other ways of running the joint. Sadly, Paul died a little more than a year ago. A book of essays in his honour called The Public City has just been published, and Erica will join us to talk about Paul and his activism as our next guest.
On 774 ABC Melbourne.
We're joined in the studio now by Erica Chavini. Erica's a blogger and an academic, and she was the partner of Paul Mees. Paul Mees was the original public transport activist here in Melbourne. Sadly, though, he died a little more than a year ago. In his honour, his colleagues have put together a book, essays in honour of Paul Mees. The book's called The Public City. Erica, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good to see you, and good to see you in fine shape, I might say, too.
Oh, well, you were talking about gyms earlier, and I go to the gym and I can deadlift 70 kilos. So
70?
I can outdo all of you.
You can certainly outdo me. But you've been through a grieving process since the death of your beloved Paul, and it was a long, slow and horrible death too. Tell us about Paul Mees, the man as you knew him.
Oh, gosh. How much time do we have? He was actually a complex person. He was funny. Everybody would comment on how funny Paul was.
He was one of the most sarcastically funny people I've ever met.
Yes. And he had names for everybody as well. You know, someone would be comrade, other people would be reverend or your worship, or he had this way of approaching people, and that was something about Paul. He could get on with everybody. It didn't matter what walk of life you came from. I remember, this is going back quite a few years ago, we're on a bus somewhere, I think in Brunswick, and this guy came up to Paul and said, "I've seen you before. I think I know who you are." And then he started telling us the story how he'd seen Paul on TV while he was in jail. He'd just got out of jail. So, Paul just got on with everyone.
Paul was a guest of the Wheeler Centre a number of times, and we loved having him because he was an extraordinary expert and a passionate kind of arguer. But I often used Paul as an example of what the Wheeler Centre tries to do, which is let experts, academics have a platform to talk about the thing about which they're passionate and knowledgeable, and put together an argument. And Paul was as good at it as anyone I've seen, I think.
And I think that's what the book tries to do. We know that Paul was an activist, but the book also wants to highlight his scholarship. So various people have taken his ideas and discussed them further.
Did he get...
Was he a
Sorry.
train spotter? Would you call him a train
Oh,
spotter?
gosh, no. Oh, if you did that,
'Cause
he would punch you. No,
But
he
had
wasn't violent.
He had a kind of obsessive regard for timetables and technology, and the difference between. I remember one of his best lines when I first got to know Paul on the radio was he said, "Yes, they've just announced a new timetable for the blah blah line, and it's taking us back to services that will be as good as in 1921."
Yes.
And you'd say, how does anybody know what the train service was in 1921?
Oh, because he got those timetables. He was in the libraries. He'd write away to train spotters who may have those timetables, and he would study them. But he definitely wasn't a train spotter. He just wanted to better public transport, and he wanted to do the research that other people weren't doing.
Was he massively frustrated by the failure for his arguments to kind of cut through? I mean, the thing that struck me hearing him argue was these were incredibly well-constructed, well-thought-through arguments for public transport. It was hard to hear them and not be convinced by them. And yet, in terms of their impact on public policy, did he feel he was banging his head against a wall?
Oh, he did feel frustrated, but I think there's one area where he did break through, and that is the idea about freeways. I mean, his idea always was, or based on his research, that the more freeways you build, the more cars will use them. So what's the use of building freeways? The money should really be redirected into public transport. And I think that idea's taken hold now. But yes, he was frustrated.
He also had a fundamental version of what was the public interest, and he was more than not just in transport policy, but in housing policy and urban design policy concerned at the conversion of the public interest to private gain. That was a recurring theme in all of his work about how governments had become subject to what's called rent seeking, the attacks from corporations and individuals who worked out how to get government to do things that would make them rich.
Yes.
That was fundamentally that was his recurring theme, I think. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that is fair. And that's why in his research he would look to other countries that weren't doing that sort of thing and were able to run not just public transport but other areas really well. But that's true.
I'm interested in, Liam, you must see this at the Herald Sun all the time, is one of the common themes in these two books, it seems to me, is the way in which a process that should be non-political, if you like, is kind of spoiled by it being politicised. So whether it's police policy or whether it's public transport policy or whatever, instead of a proper argument or a proper practice being allowed to cut through, what happens is it becomes muddied by partisan politics. Mm-hmm. Do you see that a lot?
Well, I knew Paul before I sort of got opted into the world of crime. I was a transport reporter, and I knew Paul from those days. And
there were some crimes committed in transport.
Yeah, he was a striking figure in that you'd go and see him speak at something like at the Wheeler Centre, and he would just be cutting through and not being polite and just embarrassing politicians of all stripes with his forceful logic. And he always reminded me of that phrase, an honest man is always in trouble. Because when he was, I remember when he was at the RACV, and it was during the era that the Bracks government was being very good at and very active and very successful in sort of duchessing, third-party stakeholders. And the RACV used to speak out for motorists on things like tolls aren't necessarily a good thing. Your grandparents might have already paid for these roads with their taxes. Why should we have to pay tolls? And then, the Bracks government sort of went to work, and this sort of stuff stopped happening. And around that time,
it shouldn't be forgotten that
Paul Mees had to leave the RACV around that time.
It shouldn't be forgotten that Steve Bracks and John Brumby promised no tolls on the East Link, and then introduced tolls on the East Link and said, we have no choice, we're going to have to do it, and then copped it big time. They also introduced Mikey. He was scathing about Mikey from its inception and was constantly trying to help, but no one ever took any notice of him.
No. I mean, he was so scathing of Mikey that in the beginning when you could get your free Mikey cards, he didn't apply for one. I did, and so did my dog. And and so when it was finally introduced and we had to use the cards, well, I said to Paul, there is Mr. S. Boncheck's card. You can use that one. And so he was travelling around on the dog's card.
But he was way ahead of the
Yes.
game in saying,
Yes.
no, don't do that because of this, and people wouldn't take any notice. Likewise on the signalling upgrade. I remember interviewing him countless times about how they were wasting money by not doing the signalling upgrade the proper way, and they'd try and argue Transport Minister after Transport Minister, Labor, Liberal, it didn't matter. They'd say, we can't have greater frequency of trains, and Paul would just demolish them and say, rubbish. Trains run every however many minutes in the Paris metro, however many minutes frequency in the underground and Madrid and all the other places. He'd say, you just don't know what you're talking about. And he had such authority.
But that's what I mean. He had that authority, and yet the ability to cut through. The nature of public intellectual life in this country at this point in time is that sometimes a good argument doesn't seem to be enough. And I'm baffled by that. That, you know, all of us had different contact with Paul in different ways as he constructed his argument, and were impressed by it. And yet, as John says, successive ministers took no notice.
Advised by a bureaucracy who regarded Paul, I suspect, Erica, as public enemy number one.
Oh, absolutely. I think they've given him a few nicknames that I don't think I can repeat on radio. But that has been the problem, that so many transport ministers are beholden to their bureaucracy, and Paul often talked about that.
Now, he ran foul of bureaucracy himself, though, at the University of Melbourne,
That's
famously.
right. Yes.
Is it now safe to tell the story about why?
Oh, well, I've written a little bit about it in the book.
He was an academic at the University of Melbourne, and then suddenly he wasn't anymore.
No. Although, what happened was that he was giving a talk, and he described some of the bureaucrats as liars and frauds who should be in jail. And the podcast was put up on the Melbourne University website. It was there for a couple of months. And then someone in the government complained about it to the university. And then there were investigations into this. Did Paul bring the university into disrepute? Anyway, finally, all those charges were, if you can call them charges, were dismissed. But in the meantime, Paul decided he'd leave the university and go to RMIT. I think some people believe that he was kicked out of Melbourne University. He wasn't.
But he wasn't enjoying good relations with the University of Melbourne by that stage, because they wanted him to tone it down, and he said, no, I won't. No,
that's right, because it comes back to that whole idea of academic freedom, and he saw his job as trying to reveal the truth. But he was shut down.
Did you ever say to him, oh, come on, Paul, it's a good university, you can just
pull your head in?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I probably encouraged him. No, well, with the blog I do, it's all on higher education, so...
I like the happy ending of this is Melbourne University Publishing have published the book.
I was just about to say that.
There's clearly, no bad blood there.
No, I was just about to say that the idea was hatched just after Paul died, and one of the editors, Brendan Gleeson, and Evan Thornley of Look Smart fame, actually went to see Glyn Davis at Melbourne University, and he decided to put money in for the book to be published, as did RMIT, and Margaret Gardner, his wife, was Vice-Chancellor at the time, and she's now at Monash, and yep.
All was forgiven. If you wander around the city of Melbourne, there are various statues in honour of people who have made a contribution as premiers, generals, statesmen, mostly men.
Vampire gigolos,
no. But I seriously, if you were looking to commission a statue for someone whose contribution to this city should never be forgotten and who would have gone on to make an even greater contribution to our public life, a statue of Paul Mees would be entirely appropriate alongside whoever else there is.
I'm not sure what he'd think about
He'd
that.
laugh himself silly. He'd say, "You are joking, but I'm not."
Put it on a bench at platform 10 at Flinders Street. It would be nice to...
He's much
remember.
missed, Erica, I'm sure, by you more than any of the rest of us,
Absolutely.
and I understand that. The Public City Essays in Honour of Paul Mees has been edited by Brendan Gleeson and Bo Beezer. His colleagues at the universities have come together. They've written some most stimulating pieces, and it makes for a fine read. Erica Chavini, who is Paul's wife and a contributor too to the book. Erica has been our guest. With Liam Houlihan, Once Upon a Time in Melbourne. Don't wait for the film. No, read the book. Dirty Cops, Lying Politicians, Vampire Gigolos. An unbelievable true story. Liam Houlihan, our other guest on the Conversation Hour today. Thank you all for coming on 774 ABC Melbourne. This has been your Conversation Hour.
The Conversation Hour podcasts are available at abc.net.au/Melbourne. Subscribe now and you'll receive automatic updates with special guests, interesting interviews. It's a bit of fun. You'll be mad not to subscribe. abc.net.au/Melbourne.
Jon Faine.
On radio, online and on digital.
The Conversation Hour on 774 ABC Melbourne.
And on ABC Victoria.
My co-host, before we talk about Melbourne's seedy underbelly with one of our guests, our first guest joining us shortly, my co-host from the Wheeler Centre is Michael Williams, Director of the Wheeler Centre for Books, Writing and Ideas.
Thank you, John, for sparing me from a seedy underbelly segue, which I thought was where we were going to go there. So.
Your belly is safe.
It is.
In this
It's
studio.
neither seedy above nor underneath, I hope. I don't know. I don't examine it that closely.
Well, how long are we going to?
I think it's probably best to move on.
I know mine is getting larger, and I'm determined to do something about that. But over the summer break,
Over the summer break, so that's
yeah.
very diligent. Whereas I similarly determined to do something about my girth and decided I wanted to do it before the summer break so I could enjoy summer in an unfettered fashion.
but it didn't happen. You're not girth by sea.
It's very insulting, John. I thought you might have noticed that I'm a streamlined version of myself today.
Are you?
Listeners can probably hear it in my voice, but it's I'm a shadow of my former self.
Streamlined,
Well, what can I say? I'm very aerodynamic.
svelte.
Something
Michael
like that.
Williams.
Something like that.
It's not the word that comes to mind. I say that with great affection.
No. It's fine. I hide my svelte light under a bushel.
In fact, if you're svelte, we need to redefine svelte.
Really, all I've ever wanted, John, was to be the man responsible for redefining a word. So that might do it. That might do it for us.
Single-handedly, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, how's the Wheeler Centre?
The Wheeler Centre's
What's up?
all going very well. We're about to break for Christmas. We don't program in December, January. So last night I went out to the Frankston Arts Centre with Tom Keneally and Robin Annear and watched the two of them have a fantastic conversation. That was the last part of our regular programming for 2014.
Tom Keneally, straight from the studio here down to Frankston.
Straight from the studio to Frankston. And he was as wonderful there as he was here. He's really a treasure.
I don't quite know at the age of 79 how he finds all that energy. It's fantastic.
He also has one of the best laughs in the business. He's quite the cackle.
Yep.
So it's a good thing. But we do a pre-Christmas show that finishes off our year, which is always a ridiculous amount of fun, where we ask a dozen storytellers each to choose an event from a calendar month through the year and tell a story about it.
Of their
play
year?
a song. Of the geopolitical, social,
Oh, anything.
cultural year, anything. So from Germany's World Cup win to planes disappearing from the air to
there
a
was
million
that.
things in between.
Okay.
So each of them has to take one of those events and make something of it for us.
And
A
what did they-
story, a poem, a song.
When's that?
That is, I should have the date in front of me. It's the 11th of December, which is next Thursday.
And who are the people?
We do it at the Athenaeum, and the lineup is great. Casey Bonetto hosts for us, and
wonderful,
is
wonderful
always
man.
sensational,
Yep.
and puts a number of fabulous things to song. We have people from Sean McAuliffe to Dr. Carl.
People from Sean McAuliffe.
People such as from Sean McAuliffe to Dr. Carl. That was
So
the
Sean
from.
McAuliffe and Dr. Carl.
Those two. Omar Musa, who's wonderful. Zara Newman, you may know. Helen Razor, Bernard Keane, Hannah Kent. It's a star-studded lineup. John. Who's who? Lior.
The idea being that they're funny as well as pithy.
Some of them are funny. Some of them will be moving and heartfelt. We did it last year, and the musician Henry Wagons did a song that was in part about the death of Lou Reed and in part about the birth of his first son. So he went personal as much as anything else. And so it's lovely. So it's been a big year. The thing that happens when you do an event like that is you suddenly realise all the things that happened in the year that you have to, Philip Seymour Hoffman or Robin Williams, both dying, both kind of significant moments in the year. A little hard to put to song, I would have thought, but we'll see.
Oh, no, people might. But it's the 3rd of December, so it's not until usually about the 23rd or even the 28th or thereabouts that you get all the big things that happened this year kind of edition in the newspaper, isn't it?
It's true. We're leading the way. We're going early. What happened
You've
last year?
You've noticed that the year's coming to an end before they have.
Look, we're very astute at the Wheeler Centre, John. Yeah. We've worked out there's a pattern going on. And I think if you hang in there in a few weeks' time, you're going to see the year come to an end. The thing that happened last year, of course, is that 3 days out from the event, Nelson Mandela died. So that felt like a significant moment in the year that needed to be captured as part of the night. But
I don't think it just felt like it. It actually was.
Yep,
and when you
you're
look
right.
at this year, Gough Whitlam, and you sit there and go, well, first of all, what an enormously significant figure in Australian history. And even for people who didn't agree with his policies or didn't agree with his politics, everyone could acknowledge the extraordinary changes that he introduced to Australia. And I guess when you look at you look at comings and goings, as you do at the end of the year, and you look at the positives and the negatives on the ledger sheet, I guess Gough's going to feature big time on that.
The thing that I hope is that when a figure like that dies, it gives us pause to stop and reflect on the kind of cultural values that we hold. So regardless of the normal kind of binary, this is where I am on the political spectrum, these are the goodies, these are the baddies, actually it forces us to think about what a contribution to public life might look like, what kind of society we want to belong to. I think there's a